Hi, good evening. Tonight I'd like to reflect with you on the Gospel for Friday of the 23rd week in Ordinary Time. It's taken from Luke chapter 6, verses 39 through 42. Jesus told his disciples a parable. Can a blind person guide a blind person? Will not both fall into a pit? No disciple is superior to the teacher, but when fully trained, every disciple will be like his teacher. Why do you notice the splinter in your brother's eye, but do not perceive the wooden beam in your own? How can you say to your brother, "Brother, let me remove that splinter in your eye," when you do not even notice the wooden beam in your own eye? You hypocrite, remove the wooden beam first from your eye. Then you will see clearly to remove the splinter from your brother's eye. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. Well, earlier this week, we heard St. Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount, which is really the Sermon on the Plain. We heard his version of the Beatitudes with its blessings and woes, which forced us to look at our own interior attitudes. Where do we seek our security? In the things of this world, in human respect and worldly wealth, or in the Lord? Or can we be content and happy being poor and hungry as long as we have the Lord in our life? Would we be willing to be hated and suffer for him and so get our reward in heaven? After inviting the disciples to check their attitudes, Jesus then also invites his disciples, who are to learn from him, to practice what he teaches. And he teaches them to love their enemies, to pray for those who mistreat them, to turn the other cheek, to go the extra mile, to give both one's cloak and one's tunic. These sayings of Jesus, the practical morality of the sermon, are seemingly impossible. They sound like nice sayings, but impossible for us. Of course, with God, all things are possible. And Jesus proved that they were possible, especially during his passion, where he turned the other cheek, where he loved his enemies and suffered and died for them. He even prayed for them, "Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing." He gives us the way to be imitated. We are his disciples, and we must learn from the teacher. And in learning and spending time with the teacher, more and more, we will be like the teacher. We may not be superior to him. We never will be. He's true God and true man. But we can train in his way of life. When fully trained, every disciple will be like his teacher. Jesus wants us to conform our lives to his, to love as he loved, to live as he lived. The essence of human life and of Christian existence, then, is to become fully trained. We are all disciples, and we always will be disciples in need of further training. Today, it is a slogan almost adopted from Pope Francis, missionary disciples. This term was used during the Aparecida conference and later in the Aparecida document. But what they carefully point out is that we are always disciples, and we are disciples first before we can be missionaries. But in order to be disciples or to be missionaries, we need training. And God provides training through his word, through his church, and through the sufferings and little humiliations, sometimes big humiliations, that he permits. In the gospel, we hear of a splinter in a wooden beam. Jesus indicates that he wants us to be attentive to the ways in which we need to grow, to those aspects of our own conduct that still need to be trained, rather than to obsess about other people's faults, flaws, weaknesses, and sins. Sometimes, and I think people often confess this, I judged others. I was too judgmental. To judge others, I must assume that I am the center of the world, the omniscient center whose every insight is perfect, even infallible. And as such, God ceases to be the center of my life. In fact, it's a form of idolatry. I place myself in the position of God. And that is why the Holy Father, Pope Francis, constantly warns against being a self-referential church. Rather, we should be God-centered. Earlier this year, in his Epiphany homily, he talked about how worship is directed toward God. If we are God-centered and allow ourselves to be conformed to Christ, we would forgive every offense. Or for someone who is truly sorry, my judgment would consist of forgiveness and mercy. For my judgment would acknowledge the misery that underlies so many human actions, especially hurtful ones. The habit of judging others entrenches us in the impossibility of receiving God's forgiveness, not because God does not offer us mercy or forgiveness, but because we cease little by little, to think of ourselves as needing it. We set ourselves up as the just judge and arbiter of everything. I am always right. Instead, by refusing to judge others, I am training myself in the divine art of forgiveness. With respect to our neighbor, whether it is literally our neighbor, or someone in the parish, or someone to whom I might minister, I have a choice whether to judge or to forgive, whether to exclude or to love. But in yesterday's gospel, we were told, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." Stop condemning, and you will not be condemned. The measure with which you measure will in turn be measured out to you. We have a choice to judge or to forgive, to exclude or love. Of course, the call of every disciple is to love. To be God-centered and to be forgiving, to give up judgmentalness on a consistent basis, we need training. In the first reading from today's Mass, from the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians, Paul spoke of athletes who needed training. He said, "Do you not know that runners in the stadium all run in the race, but only one wins the prize? Run so as to win. Every athlete exercises discipline in every way. They do it to win a perishable crown, but we, an imperishable one." The required discipline in the spiritual life comes not through punishment and severity. Rather, it comes by imitating the good example of those around us. Whether it's the lives of the saints or pious parents, we need to imitate good example. Today, September 11th, is not only a day in which we mourn all those lives lost on that day through terrorist attacks, and when we are challenged to love our enemies and to pray for those who mistreat us. Today, September 11th, in the Church of the United States, is a day of prayer and penance for those victims of clerical sexual abuse. How we should imitate the example of good priests, but how many priests failed to imitate the example of Jesus, the Good Shepherd? And instead of tending the flock, they devoured the flock. They used the flock. Yes, we must do acts of penance and mortification to make reparation for these types of sins and commit ourselves thoroughly to protecting children, but also to being the priests and people God has called us to be. And that requires discipline, the ascetical life. We have to imitate the good example of the saints. At least that was the method of St. Paul. He wrote to the Corinthians, "I do not run aimlessly. I do not fight as if I were shadowboxing. No, I drive my body. I train it, for fear that after having preached to others, I myself should be disqualified." We don't want to be disqualified from the race, because what's at stake in the race is salvation. In other words, we need to nurture our friendship each and every day, be disciplined in the life of prayer, regular Mass, regular sacraments, reading the scriptures, praying, fasting, giving alms, especially to the poor. Paul, when he was saying, "I drive my body and train it," was saying, each and every day, I also have to take a look at myself and see where I fall short and try to improve. What are my faults? Paul, little by little, was removing the beams from his life, from his own eye. And that was why he was able to see so clearly how best to help others, to preach so effectively the words that they really needed to hear. The disciples' training necessarily involves ongoing and deeper conversion to Christ. If we think about imitation of Christ, then we ought to think about humble service. Certainly St. Paul did this when he made himself a slave to all, so as to win over as many as possible, becoming all things to all to save at least some. His love and his recognition of God's love for his people became the driving force of his zeal. This then must be the driving force of our mission. For although we are disciples first, as I said, we are also missionaries. And our mission is not motivated by worldly respect, honors, or influence, or whether in the church or in the world. Rather, our mission flows from an interior obligation, from having been privileged to be called by name to this way of life, to be privileged to have heard the gospel. And this interior obligation is to share the joy of what we ourselves have received, the gospel of his mercy. This is why St. Paul could also say, "Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel." May we preach the gospel always in word and in deed. God bless you.